Have you ever wanted the ability to go back and put an ad in an old episode that's doing so well, but it just isn't promoting what you're talking about right now? Dynamic content is the solution, and we're going to talk about how you could be using it today on this episode. So, let's get into it. Welcome to Uncommonly More with Stacey Harris. I am Stacey. I'm the host of this show and the CEO of podcast production agency Uncommonly More. My team and I work with podcasters just like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of sales teams with professional, strategic podcast production. You know what? I think that's enough. Let's get into the show and we'll talk more there. Welcome. We are talking about dynamic content today. We're going to talk about what it is and how you can be using it and the tools you will need to be able to use dynamic content because not everybody uses it. Before we get into that though, we do have a brand new episode of the Podcast Newsroom out now. Fair warning, I do kick off the show with our annual reminder that Q4 is coming up and how to prepare for that. What else do we talk about? We talk about YouTube podcasts and some things that are happening in that space. And we also talk about Libsyn stat display change, and we talk a little bit about IAB stats. So check that out at podcastnewsroom.com. It is a private podcast. You do sign up with an email address, but it's the best place to get inside information. It's the newsroom with the news you need for a more profitable podcast. So head over to the podcastnewsroom.com and make sure you have access. Let's dig in on dynamic content first by defining what is dynamic content. Dynamic content is the ability to put in additional content to all or a select few set of your episodes on a changing basis without having to change the root podcast file. So I'm able to run a pre-roll, a post-roll, or in some tools, a mid-roll that is changeable. If you have ever listened to a podcast and gotten like a current ad, but you know for sure it was an old podcast, like let's say you are listening to Armchair Expert and you hear a Pacifica commercial for a Labor Day weekend sale, and you're like, wow, that's weird because this episode is like the third episode they ever did. That's a dynamic ad. That is something they're putting in and placing separately than the audio file for the show. Whereas our traditional audios, or ads rather, sit inside the show, right? We're saying them. A great example is me talking about the Podcast Newsroom a minute ago. That was me sort of host read in the show. It's going to be hard for me to change that later without taking this file, reopening it, re-editing it, and then re-uploading it to the host, which is an option. And it's something we've done more than once. We've had sort of multiple versions of a show exist, and we went in and swapped the file after a certain point because it allowed us to go in and take something that was launch content and built as an asset, take it from, hey, the doors are open to, hey, there's a wait list. Because the traffic to that episode was still really solid, we wanted to make sure those people weren't just sort of ending up in a endless cycle of the course is open, but instead going in and getting on the wait list so that when the course reopened, they could take advantage of that. Now you can do this with dynamic content. Now, I want to say, first and foremost, dynamic content has some things you need to be aware of. From a mix perspective, from a sound perspective, you want to make sure your volumes are on point. You do not want this ad set to be aggressive. We've all listened to drive time radio and we're driving home and we are rocking out to this summer song of the summer, you know what I'm trying to say. And then aggressively you get ba-ba-ba-ba, used car sale this weekend only. Like we've all gotten that and it's aggressive and we don't like it, right? We don't want to create that environment. That's not going to be a good first impression. And so it's absolutely critical we be paying attention to what it's going to go inside of and what it's going to sit next to. This is most important if you're using a tool that allows you to embed these dynamic ads inside of the episode, meaning not as a pre-roll and not as a post-roll. So not at the very beginning and not at the very end, but instead somewhere in the middle of that content. And those tools are really great. Libsyn is a great example of a tool you can use this with. You go through and you define what those spots are in the episodes, which is going to be laborious depending on how many episodes you have, because I would recommend actually strategically placing those dynamic ad spots. Pre-rolls, post-rolls, you have a little more leeway. I don't need to go and make sure it's going to sound good next to what it's in. I can make sure I'm not going to be interrupting some sort of important or inappropriate placement. It's not going to sit next to something it shouldn't be sitting next to because it's at the beginning. And so we've got ad, show hook, intro music, my sort of intro promo piece, and then we get into content. So again, we've got some leeway there. Now, if you have a pre-roll ad spot, you might want to be conscientious about how you're using that intro area, whereas I promo right there, maybe not great if you have an ad roll. It's going to depend on what that ad roll is. The other thing I want you to be aware of is how long a dynamic ad sits up. By its very nature, a dynamic ad is dynamic, like it's right there in the name, bro. You know what I mean? So where are you consistently changing this? And for me, the bigger question becomes, how are you managing what it needs to be now? So if you don't have a really good grasp on your marketing strategy, on your sales cycles, on your timing, dynamic ads might not be the move yet. And so if you are somebody who has a really clear understanding of we've got these launch windows and these are the kind of things we cycle through and this is what we sell in the course of the year and here's what we would want to be promoting, you can absolutely be creating those and cycling them through. We have, for our clients who run dynamic ads, specific boards, just like we have a dashboard for the podcast, we have a dashboard for dynamic ads that's kept separately so that we can include the timeline. This is when it goes up. This is when it comes down. This is what needs to happen in that space. It makes it really incredibly simple for us to be just looking at a dashboard, figuring out what needs to be there, and making sure that's really what's running. Let's talk a little bit about the last sort of nuance here, which is that not every tool uses or allows you to use dynamic ads. There's two providers I want to talk about today. I like the way both of these providers do this, but they do it very differently. These are the two hosts I most frequently recommend to our podcasters. We have a couple of clients who we've actually moved to one of these platforms. I think we currently only have one show not on one of these two platforms that we produce. In fact, we had two, and now we're moving one of them to one of these platforms. So these are the ones I use. First, we'll talk about the one this show was hosted with, and that is Libsyn. With Libsyn and Libsyn Pro, you can do dynamic ads. The cool thing about Libsyn is they will allow for those mid-roll kind of dynamic ads. It just means that you have to go in and mark the spots where those dynamic ads are going to sit. So you've got to be aware of that. You would reach out directly to Libsyn. They would onboard you into that, and you would go through that process with them. It's a great tool. I love it. I'm not going to dig into the technical ways to do this because it's not a good use of our time together, but that's the tool number one that I would recommend. Tool number two, and this is the one I recommend if you are DIYing your show still, if you're unsure of how dynamic ads are going to look for you, if you want to be able to just sort of quickly be able to, at the front or back of your show, have a new ad running every couple of weeks, cool. Use Buzzsprout. I really love Buzzsprout. It's a great tool. Again, it's not what I host on, but we have a couple of clients who are on Buzzsprout, and their dynamic ad setup is really, really simple. You seriously just go to a tab that says dynamic content, and you mark which ones you want. You can select the episodes that you want, so you don't have to include every episode. Maybe you have a special episode about a more sensitive topic, or maybe you don't want to feature ad rolls on solo episodes because you have an ingrained promo inside of those solo episodes, but you want to make sure your guest episodes or your coaching episodes or your case study episodes do include a solid pre-roll or post-roll because you don't have as much time to feed the offer in that two-person or multiple-person conversation. Awesome. This is a great way to go in and be able to select the episodes you want to be able to include it in and exclude the episodes you want to skip for the dynamic ads. Really, really simple, all on your dashboard right in Buzzsprout. So those are the two tools I recommend above all, just in general, to be honest, but also specifically if you want to be running dynamic content, both of them offer that, and in slightly different ways. I'd argue that if you want to get heavy into dynamic content, if you are somebody who wants to be able to run mid-roll dynamic ads, if you are somebody who wants to be able to have your producer or someone on your production team go and find all of those timestamp spots or mark all of those timestamp spots for you, Libsyn's the way to go. If you're somebody who wants to be able to DIY your dynamic content, you want it to be pretty simple. You want it to go right up at the top or right up at the end, although I would say right up at the top. If you want to be able to do that really easily, really quickly, Buzzsprout is the move all the way for that. So check out those two tools. So we've gotten to the what, we've gotten to the how. Let's talk a little bit about the why. Why would you do this? What are some work cases? What are some positions in which this would be valuable? If you're somebody who runs a one or more sort of annual courses, you have programs that you put people in once a year. Let's say, we're going into Q4. A lot of our clients, when we are sitting down for our, what are we selling this quarter? I already know what it is. We're selling the same mastermind we sell every year, right? So what are those things for you that are those annual pieces? This is really helpful because instead of having 6 or 8 episodes in Q4 of your year where you're selling this thing and they end up being some of your most popular episodes, so they're these great assets, but they're selling a program that's closed, you can go in and say, hey, this mastermind's not available right now, but a great way to gear up for this for next year is this secondary program that I sell the rest of the year. Or make sure you're on the wait list for when we open the doors in October for our following year enrollment. Whatever the case may be, you can still leverage those assets. You can still find a way to serve and nurture that audience, especially that interested audience, without destroying yourself, without being I've got to go in and re-upload all of those or whatever. It's just recording it and flipping a switch. It's really, really simple. Another great work case of this is if you have something you sort of cycle between. So for me, a great example of this would be production and a secondary service. So when we open our single session calls, we have started opening and closing those. They're not open all the time because with our client roster having priority, always, our production clients always have priority. We're in it the deepest with them. And I have 4 times a year where a month is sort of filled with those calls. And so I don't have time to take on single session calls, but I do sometimes. For example, I'll have some space for standalone conversations in October of this year. I'll have some in January of next year. I'll have some time because those aren't months where I've got heavy client call responsibilities with our production clients. So I could be running dynamic ads saying, hey, right now is the time to get in to get one of those calls. I've got it opened because I only book them 1 month at a time when they are available. That's it. The other times I have that calendar straight up closed so as to not overbook myself. And also to be really honest about these aren't available right now. I don't know when it will be, and I can open them and close them as I have capacity. So I could flip on and off a dynamic ad promoting those across all of my episodes without a lot of additional effort or frustration, which makes it easy for me to sell that thing I don't sell all the time, and I just kind of sell as I have capacity. So that's another great case study or work study for dynamic ads. Now, you'll notice we don't actually run dynamic ads right now on this show because really I just sell production all of the time, but you never know. This is a great way for you to do it if you wanted to do that. Another option is a wait list. Is when something is switched to a wait list, the episodes that promote that membership get dynamic ads for a wait list. And when it's open, the dynamic ad is flipped to hey, we're open now. Make sure you come join us. And that runs at the top of the episode, and then it goes into your sales asset. And so if you're somebody who opens the doors for their course or membership, let's say quarterly, you can just be flipping back between those 2 dynamic ads, and you can be managing all of that on a dashboard. This is incredible. If this is something you want support with, if you're listening to this and you're like, Stacy, yes, please, how do we do this? I want to talk to you. Let's have a conversation about what production as a whole looks like, because this gets possible when you have real line of sight on what your show and a firm understanding of how your show is a sales and marketing asset. When you have that clear line of sight over what's happening, and that's exactly what we do with our clients. Something that I shared for the very first time in the Podcast Newsroom episode going out in September was the fact that we will only be taking 2 more new production clients this year. With our 2 weeks off at the end of the year, which I talk about on that episode, we also work ahead for our show and for our client's show. I love to have everything scheduled for everybody through the end of January before we take off at the end of December. So that means working ahead. It means us working ahead. It means our clients working ahead. And so onboarding, adding someone else in Q4 is just too hard. It's not of service to the new client. It's not of service to our existing clients. And it's not of service to our team, which is a lose, my friend. And so we will be having conversations for those who have interest in starting with us in January throughout Q4. But if this is something you want to do now, if this is something you want to cross off your to-do list so that we go in to 2023 already established, now's the time to book those conversations. So head over to uncommonlymore.com/podcast production and find a time for you and I to sit down and have this conversation so that we can get you onboarded in October and geared up so that you too can be taking a little bit of a break from your production as we reach the end of this year, and you can start the year strong with support. I will see you on that call and back here next week. If you made it to this point of the show and you still happen to be listening, which statistically is unlikely, I want to say thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I want to hear from you. So reach out on social or via email and let me know what actions you're going to take from today's episode, because honestly, that's why we produce the show. That's why I record this show. It's why my team does all the work to release this show, is so that we can help you. You can help make a difference in your show and consequently in your business. If you haven't left a review for the show, head over to ratethispod.com/more. It's an easy way to show some love to the show and also help us reach more podcasters who are looking for the same kind of support you were looking for. If you have any suggestions or ideas or thoughts you would like me to address on the show, be sure to reach out. Again, like I say a lot, this is the start of the conversation, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.